First, the smell. Not incense or frankincense, but hot wax used to fill cracks in old books. The morning in the city archives begins with this smell, sweet and rotten, as if the paper itself breathes the past. Among the shelves, in the dust and dim light, a document is found, like a forgotten bone from a bygone era. Collection for the welfare of unmarried craftswomen. The line is unstamped, but neatly signed, as if someone had tried to make the lie official. This is the beginning of a story in which morality and accounting are intertwined in a knot from which neither the officials nor those whom they taxed for morality could extricate themselves for a long time. Hello, friends. Welcome to the channel. My name is Storyteller, and today we will examine one of the strangest and most disturbing cases of urban taxation in the late Middle Ages. Right where you are watching from, which city, which country, and whether you have ever heard of taxes for chastity. Now make yourself comfortable. We are beginning our investigation. Enjoy listening. The city where all this happened was not a capital, and was not famous for its great cathedrals. It was a trading center, surrounded by mills, painted courtyards, and weavers' workshops. Women worked here on an equal footing with men. They spun, dyed, and sewed. Many of them did not have husbands, not because they rejected family life, but because their craft was their life and livelihood. They paid taxes as craftswomen, joined guilds, and obeyed the rules. But one day, in the early 16th century, they began to receive new receipts with the words, "For the protection of morals and chastity." The amount was small, but the very meaning seemed offensive, as if an unmarried woman was already suspicious. The first complaints were quiet. Some thought it was a joke, others thought it was a misunderstanding. But the receipts kept coming, with new dates and new stamps. They stated that the fee was set by decree of the quarter, as if the city itself had delegated morality to a select group of officials. Records have been preserved in the archives. The same clerk wrote them out for dozens of craftswomen, changing only the name and the amount. At the bottom was a note in favor of the charity hospital. Thus, for the first time, the accounting department combined shame and charity into a single budget item. A weaver named Elsbeth, who lived in the lower quarter, did not believe it. She knew the statutes, could read, and kept her own records of income. There was nothing like this in the old city collections, published under the previous magistrate. They listed the usual taxes for a shop, for a place in the market, for the use of water, for night watch, but not for morals. Elsbeth compared the wording and saw a discrepancy. In the official books, the tax was called a contribution to community institutions, without specifying gender or marital status. So someone had changed the wording and started collecting money under the guise of the old law. When she tried to find out who exactly was doing this, she was sent to the office, where 3 accountants and 1 collector were working. There, she was shown a statement marked, "Based on the decision of the parish council. But this council, as it turned out, existed only on paper. It was not listed in the archives, and the signatures on the documents belonged to people who had died several years ago. This was the first clue, an accounting ghost created to justify the levy. The magistrate she approached responded evasively. They said that neighborhood traditions allowed funds to be collected for the hospital by any means necessary. They said that unmarried women used to make such contributions out of respect for God's law on marriage. But no charter or city ordinance confirming this has ever been found. Only legends about spoiled maidens who were allegedly punished with a silver coin for not finding a husband before the age of 25. Legends, not law. And yet these legends proved convenient for the magistrate. Using them as a cover, officials continued to collect the tax. Then Elsbeth decided to conduct her own investigation. She spent several days in the city archives, which smelled of mold and ink, checking the records. She wrote down the dates and amounts from the tax books and noticed a strange pattern. The chastity tax appeared in the very months when the hospital submitted requests for additional funding. Officially, the money was for repairing beds and purchasing medicines, but the amounts did not add up. The money disappeared, and the reports were signed retroactively. One of the statements bore the name of the same collector who had brought her the receipt. Thus, a private initiative turned into a whole system, a legalized levy hidden between the lines. Meanwhile, rumors of a tax on unmarried women spread throughout the artisan quarters. Some began to pay to avoid scandal, while others simply did not understand whether they had the right to refuse. In a city where a woman's honor was measured by the opinion of her neighbors, any doubt about her piety was dangerous. Refusal to pay was perceived as an admission of sin. Thus, the pressure became invisible but palpable. Society itself supported the fictitious law, fearing to appear impure. Later, it turned out that the hospital was indeed suffering from underfunding. After the winter epidemic, when more than 40 people died, medicine supplies were depleted, and part of the building burned down due to careless handling of a candle. The magistrate was obliged to restore the institution, but the treasury was empty. The costs of the city festival and pavement repairs had eaten up most of the budget. Then, the accounting department found a solution to create a temporary levy without bothering to get the council's approval. The wording was quickly devised, a contribution for chastity, so that it could be presented as an act of moral support. When the city press recalled this incident years later, it was explained away as a clerical error. But the surviving documents show that there was no mistake. It was a calculated move. Dozens of women who worked alone, without husbands or guild protection, became the most convenient donors. Not because they were rich, but because they were defenseless. No one represented them at meetings. They had no right to vote, and their names rarely appeared in the minutes. In this way, the system covered up the treasury's deficit with the bodies of those who did not fit into the social norm. Elsbeth collected copies of all the documents she found and sent a petition to the court, citing the city charter, which prohibited levies without the approval of the council. This step was a turning point. For the first time in many years, a simple craftswoman had directly opposed the magistrate. The court accepted the complaint for consideration, but the hearing dragged on for months. During this time, a campaign of rumors began against her, claiming that she disregarded virtue and disturbed the peace. Thus, morality once again became a weapon, used against someone who was trying to prove the truth with documents. When the trial finally began, the judges discovered an interesting detail. The decree on the Pious collection was dated after the former treasurer had already died. This meant that the signature on it was forged. The investigation revealed that the accounting department had indeed used fictitious documents to cover a hole in the hospital's budget. One of the clerks admitted that he had acted on orders from above, but the name of this above was never revealed. The magistrate hastened to declare it all a private initiative that got out of hand. However, traces remained in the city books, lines where the word morality stood next to amounts and dates. The story then became broader than just a dispute over taxes. It showed how religious concepts were turned into financial instruments. The church was already losing its influence in matters of city administration, but the language of sermons remained convenient for the authorities. It was easier to talk about morality than bankruptcy. Sermons did indeed mention the duty of purity and supporting good deeds, but none of them implied monetary collections. It was manipulation, replacing spiritual guilt with material guilt, and thus turning conscience into a source of income. When the court handed down its ruling, the wording was cautious. The collection is deemed inconsistent with the statutes, to be canceled, and a transparent system of voluntary contributions is to be established. For most residents, this sounded like a victory for justice. But for Elsbeth, it was a bitter confirmation that justice in the city comes at a price. After all, none of those who came up with the levy were punished. They simply rewrote the documents, crossing out the extra lines as if nothing had happened. And in the following year's reports, a new line appeared: contribution to maintaining the moral spirit of the hospital. Voluntary, of course. But people knew that voluntariness within these walls was always relative. Historians would later call this case an example of the economy of virtue, when morality was used as a tool of fiscal policy. Similar schemes were found in various European cities: taxes on widows, fees for street cleaning, duties for blessing marriages. All of them were cloaked in words of piety, but in essence served to patch holes in budgets. Thus, religious rhetoric became accounting language, and faith became a source of income. This story has no heroes in the usual sense. There are no winners here, only those who survived in a system where shame became currency. After the trial, Elsbeth returned to work, but no longer participated in guild meetings. Her name disappeared from the records 3 years later. Perhaps she left. Perhaps she simply grew tired of fighting. But the document she left behind has been preserved, And every time it is opened, it becomes clear that the true morality of a city is determined not by sermons, but by how it treats those who do not fit into its norms. If we consider this case not as an exception, but as a symptom of the era, it becomes clear that late medieval cities lived on the borderline between religious morality and economic pragmatism. The system of taxes and fines was not just a financial instrument. It reflected the structure of fear. Every document, every entry in the revenue book, reminded the townspeople that the authorities knew everything about them: how much they earned, who they lived with, what they wore, how they prayed. Therefore, the introduction of morality taxes did not seem absurd to contemporaries. On the contrary, it seemed a logical continuation of a culture where any action could be measured in silver. In the German and Flemish lands of that time, there were dozens of similar levies. For example, in the cities of the Hanseatic League, unmarried women paid a so-called cover fee. Formally, it was insurance against rumors, but in fact, it was a way to control the behavior of those who did not have a husband. In Italian communes, there were fines for living outside the head of the family. They were justified by concern for order, but the money went to hospitals, shelters, and even city prisons. Some statutes explicitly stated that a girl without a guardian burdens the conscience of the neighborhood. This phrase would later be cited as an example of administrative absurdity, but at the time it seemed normal. A woman was considered not just an individual, but a link in the system of property. Without a husband or father, she was unprotected not legally, but economically, which meant she could be taxed. What happened in the city of Elsbeth was only a late echo of this tradition. But it was in her case that a turning point became apparent. At the beginning of the 16th century, European cities were experiencing a demographic and financial crisis. Epidemics, rising prices, and declining guild revenues. Magistrates were looking for new sources of revenue, and the most vulnerable became the most convenient. Reports from that time constantly mention the word compensation, a bureaucratic euphemism for legalized extortion. Anything could be compensated for. The absence of a husband, debt, even damage to public honor. Each time, it turned into a financial transaction where honor had a fixed price. In this mechanism, the role of religion as a language of justification is particularly noticeable. The documents did not say, "collect from single women." They said, "strengthen virtue." Sermons picked up on these words, not noticing the substitution. Priests said that moral purity required public support, which meant that those who remained unmarried had to contribute to the common good. Thus, what came out of the mouths of the clergy was not a threat, but a cover for a fiscal instrument. This was the horror of the era. Morality and the treasury were no longer distinguishable from each other. When the court in Elsbeth ruled the levy illegal, it did so not for the sake of women, but for the sake of order. It was not injustice that was dangerous to the authorities, but disorder in accounting. Historical records show that the court's decision does not mention discrimination. It only states that the levy has no legal basis. In other words, it was not the idea that was abolished, but the form. And this is also a symptom. The system was ready to forgive everything except unauthorized profits. The very logic of the morality tax lived on in other forms. In marriage fees, in fines for excessive luxury, in widowhood taxes. In some lands, they continued to be levied until the mid-18th century. If you open the city books of the late 17th century, you can see a striking similarity in the wording. One German archive contains a decree on maintaining spiritual order, which states that widows and maidens who enjoy freedom pay an annual tribute for the construction of charitable houses. Here again, the motif of freedom as a duty is repeated. The right to live independently had to be paid for. This was not just a financial measure, it was a symbol of how the authorities perceived independence as a suspicious luxury. A woman who was not bound by the bonds of marriage was considered a potential source of disorder, and the tax was a way of curbing this fear. The economic rationale behind such measures is obvious when you look at the structure of city expenditures. The main items in the budget went to walls, troops, and, increasingly, hospitals. Illnesses, epidemics, and injuries to artisans made medical institutions a center of constant debt. Hospitals at that time were not places of healing in the modern sense. They were shelters for the poor, the elderly, and the dying. Their maintenance fell on the city, and the charity of the rich quickly ran out. Therefore, officials sought moral grounds for levies to force those who had no voice to pay. One of the ordinances explicitly states that maintaining morality is a public good, and good requires sacrifice. Thus, morality became a legal alibi for financial exploitation. But why specifically unmarried women? The answer lies not in religion, but in the structure of property ownership. In most cities, a woman's property automatically passed to her husband's control after marriage. If there was no marriage, the woman remained the formal owner of her assets. This frightened the system. Uncontrolled assets, even small ones, meant unpredictability. Magistrates sought to regain control through taxes, fines, and regulations. Therefore, the chastity tax was not a punishment for sin, but a way to return capital to the authorities. An unmarried woman who owned a workshop or a shop was perceived as a dangerous precedent, an economic entity without a guardian. Historians from the universities of Göttingen and Bologna, who studied city archives, note the striking stability of this logic. In different countries, under different forms of government, the authorities repeatedly invented new formulations for an old fear. In Italy, it was called a contribution to virtue. In France, support for virginity, and in the German lands, a tax on purity. The amounts varied, but the meaning was the same. Society demanded that women either submit to marriage or pay for their independence. This mechanism survived the change of dynasties and even the Reformation because it did not depend on dogma. It was fueled by economics. Paradoxically, it was precisely at a time when cities were beginning to build their first hospitals and orphanages that moral rhetoric became particularly cruel. Aid to the needy depended on taxes, and taxes depended on notions of guilt. If a person was poor, it meant they were guilty. If a woman was alone, it meant she was sinful. If someone did not fit into the system, it meant they had to pay. This moral accounting language created the illusion of order in a world where poverty and disease were perceived not as a social problem, but as a consequence of a lack of piety. Therefore, the tax on morals even seemed fair. After all, those who are not guilty do not pay. So people reasoned, not understanding that sooner or later, everyone would be declared guilty. When, decades later, other cities tried to repeat similar levies, no longer hiding behind the word piety, they justified them pragmatically: contributions for medical needs. But history repeated itself. Where there is no transparent accountability, morality, once again, becomes a smokescreen. A French archive contains a report on a similar tax collected in the city of Bourges. Of the 28 leaves that went to the treasury, only 5 reached the hospital. The rest disappeared into bills for building repairs and collectors' salaries. The form changed, but the essence remained the same: exploitation through shame. Interestingly, even when such levies disappeared from the law, they continued to live on in culture. In sermons, in pamphlets, in the everyday stories of women who were checked by their neighbors or the clergy. The very idea that loneliness must be explained took root so deeply that it survived for centuries. And this, perhaps, is the most frightening legacy of those times. Once the authorities learned to turn morality into a tool for collection, they would never give it up. Only the forms would become subtler, the words softer, but the logic would remain the same. After Elsbeth's trial, however, changes did indeed take place. For the first time, the city began to keep open accounts for the hospital. The amounts of expenses were published on a board at the town hall, so that any citizen could check them. It was a rare case when the exposure of private fraud led to a reform of the system. However, even then, the magistrate did not admit guilt. He simply reworded everything. Now the contributions were called voluntary donations for the common good. Voluntary, but the collectors still went from house to house, reminding people who had paid and who was evading their civic duty. Thus, victory turned into compromise. From a historical point of view, this case is interesting not only as a social drama, but also as an illustration of how myths become laws. The myth of the chastity tax did not come out of thin air. It grew out of dozens of minor administrative tricks, out of old regulations that no one had repealed, but simply rewritten for a new purpose. When historians say that the Middle Ages were a time of superstition, they rarely specify that the main superstitions were born not in the marketplace or in taverns, but in offices. There, where paper turned rumor into rule and a signature made fiction into law. At the end of the 16th century, when religious wars were raging throughout Europe, the theme of female virtue became even more profitable. Preachers on both sides, Catholics and Protestants, used it as a symbol of moral superiority. For cities, this meant a new wave of fees and fines, now in defense of the true faith. Under these slogans, money was collected again, and fictitious councils and commissions were created again. For example, in 1589, a Swiss canton established a chastity committee that collected donations for houses of repentance. 5 years later, the committee disappeared, but the accounts remained, with the same signatures as for ordinary taxes. Morality once again served as a smokescreen for the budget. Elsbeth had long since passed away, but her name became a symbol in the chronicles. Urban legends spoke of the weaver who defeated the magistrate. Her image was later used in the fight against other taxes. Thus, the document turned into a myth, the opposite in meaning. If before lies became law, now the truth became legend. And there is something fair about this. Even if the authorities can forge signatures, they cannot rewrite people's memories. After the trial, life in the city seemed to return to normal. But the shadow of the chastity tax lingered for a long time in the streets, in conversations, and even in shopkeepers' records. Women from the artisan quarters began to sign papers more cautiously, fearing that any signature could be a reason for a new levy. The magistrate assured everyone that everything was now under control, that the accounting was transparent, and that there would be no more abuses. But people's memories, especially those who had been forced to pay under threat of shame, were not as quick to fade as the accounting books. For several years after the tax was abolished, new complaints appeared in the archives. This time, they were not about the levy itself, but about the fact that those who had refused to pay it in the past were now being ignored when it came to the distribution of municipal aid. One of the records contains the following wording: "Does not deserve assistance as she did not participate in charitable contributions in previous years." Thus, the abolished tax turned into a kind of social filter, invisible but tangible. Voluntariness turned into a test of loyalty. It was a time when the fear of being excluded from respectable society was worse than any fine. Reputation decided everything. Who would be trusted with work? Who would get a place in the market? Whose name would be entered in the guild books? After the Elsbeth case, the concept of moral participation became an unofficial currency. Officials, wanting to maintain control, found a new tool: lists of trustworthy people. They had no legal force, but too much depended on them. Getting on the list meant having a chance at protection. Staying off it meant being erased not only from the accounting books, but also from public life. The hospital that started the whole scandal was rebuilt 2 years later. Its walls were whitewashed, the beds were repaired, and a sign was hung at the entrance reading, "Maintained by the funds of good citizens." No one specified what funds were collected and under what circumstances. One of the reports contained a note that part of the donations came from the weavers. This was a veiled way of saying that the old tax had simply been reborn under a new name. On paper, everything looked respectable. Instead of tax, it was now called a donation. The difference was purely verbal, but the meaning remained the same. A strange feeling took hold among the women of the city. To avoid suspicion, it was necessary to pay at least symbolically. This is how the culture of redemption was formed, a ritual in which people themselves brought coins so as not to fall into the category of deviants. Even decades later, this custom persisted in the form of donations for candles or for decorating the altar, which were formally voluntary but expected of every unmarried woman in the artisan quarters. No one remembered the court, the decision, or the canceled tax anymore. Everything dissolved into habit, and habit dissolved into silence. A new generation of scribes, sorting through old books, noticed an interesting feature. The pages where the chastity tax was mentioned had been neatly rewritten or covered with wire. This was a standard practice of correction. But if you looked closely, you could see traces of the previous words under a thin layer of new ink. In one of the volumes, under the phrase voluntary contributions, the letters of the old term tax were visible. Historians would later say that this document was the best symbol of the era, a layer of wax hiding what was uncomfortable to admit. The Church, noticing that the topic of female piety was causing controversy, took control of it. Parishes began to hold special sermons dedicated to the duty of chastity. The priests spoke of purity as a social responsibility rather than a personal virtue. These speeches sounded not like instructions, but like reports. Every parishioner had to confirm her adherence to the ideal model of behavior. The words chastity and order gradually merged into one. In one of the surviving sermon notes, the rector directly links the moral state of the city with its economic well-being. A city where virtue is weak loses bread and water. This was not a metaphor, but a hint. Those who do not participate in pious deeds condemn everyone to poverty. Thus, the myth of the moral obligation to pay once again became an instrument of fiscal pressure. The same pattern was repeated over and over again. Religious language covered up accounting, and officials referred to sermons as the will of the people. In some parishes, priests even began to keep special lists of benefactors, noting those who made regular donations. These lists soon began to coincide with the lists of trustworthy people in the magistrate's office. The two authorities, spiritual and secular, merged into a single control mechanism. Women who had once had to pay tried to forget the shame. But the memory returned in small ways, in the looks they received at the market, in the words of their neighbors, in petty taunts. Any independence now seemed dangerous. If loneliness had previously been simply a circumstance of life, it now became a sign of suspicion. Even young apprentices in workshops heard from their elders, "Don't stick your neck out. Don't argue. Don't mention Elsbeth." The name of the woman who had once gone against the authorities became a warning. Meanwhile, archivists, recording every document, increasingly felt how the language had changed. The old categories, sin, guilt, punishment, gave way to more peaceful words: duty, participation, charity. But behind the change in vocabulary lay the same old logic. Each new term was an attempt to smooth over the memory of violence, turning it into a familiar ritual. Voluntariness became a new form of coercion, and the softer the word sounded, the tighter the control became. Neighboring cities began to adopt the experience of this system. One of the statutes explicitly stated that annual charitable collections, especially among single craftswomen, strengthen public order. Thus, one magistrate's mistake became a precedent, and the precedent became a rule. When historians later analyzed this phenomenon, they spoke of the normalization of moral feudalism, a process in which, under the guise of concern for morality, the authorities regained the right to control private life. The fate of one of the clerks who signed the fictitious documents is particularly telling. His name was Matthias Stoll. After the scandal was exposed, he was not punished, but he lost his job and worked as a copyist for a notary. 10 years later, a new version of the wording was found in his notes: contribution to the public good. Same meaning, same mechanism, just a change of words. History repeated itself, but without an open scandal. People got used to the fact that part of their earnings went to good causes without asking who decided what was good and what was not. Elsbeth, according to rumors, moved to another city, closer to the sea, where women could work as weavers without guild membership. There, her name reappeared on the taxpayer lists, but without any notes. Little is known about her further fate. There is only one document, a record of her will, which states that part of her tools and fabrics are to be donated to the hospital for good causes. Perhaps it was irony, perhaps an attempt at reconciliation. History does not say, but the wording itself sounds like an echo of an old fear. Even in death, a person could not escape the need to prove their virtue through sacrifice. By the beginning of the 17th century, the chastity tax had finally disappeared from documents. But the very idea that virtue could be measured in money did not go away. New economic treatises of the time discuss the social duty of women, stating explicitly that every woman must participate in strengthening the moral order through labor or sacrifice. This was no longer a law, but an ideology, yet its influence was no less significant. Thus, the old tax dissolved into the new morality. When modern historians examine these archives, they often note that the most frightening documents are not those that mention torture, executions, or wars. More frightening are those where evil is packaged in politeness, where coercion sounds like a request, and punishment sounds like virtue. In this sense, Elsbeth's case became a mirror of the era. The authorities learned to be gentle, but no less cruel. Among the museum exhibits, one artifact has survived to this day: a copper seal depicting a woman's hand holding a coin, with the inscription, pro pudicitia urbanae, for the sake of urban chastity, around the edge. It was once used for receipts for that very tax. The seal has darkened with age. The letters are almost worn away. But the shape of the hand is recognizable. It clutches the coin not as a gift, but as a debt. And this is perhaps the best metaphor for that system. A hand extended as if in charity, but in fact, demanding payment. When almost a century had passed since Elsbeth's case, a different spirit reigned in the same lands, not ecclesiastical, but bureaucratic. Europe was entering the early Enlightenment, and cities sought to appear rational. But the essence of control did not disappear. It simply took on a new guise. Now virtue was considered not a gift from God, but a social duty, and duty was an object of accounting. Morality descended from the church pulpit to the office. And with this, old concepts took on a new form. Instead of a chastity tax, there were now moral welfare funds, civil contributions, and support for decent institutions. One of the first such examples was the ordinance of the city of Lübeck in the mid-17th century. It stated that, in order to strengthen the integrity of citizens, a public welfare fund is being established, to which everyone who lives alone or without family obligations must make an annual payment. The wording seemed neutral, almost accounting-like, but the meaning was the same. Loneliness was once again subject to a tax. Now it was no longer about sin, but about incompatibility with social roles. If you don't feed your family, then you must feed the institution. For the first time, morality was turned into a form of statistics. People began to be counted not by name, but by category: married, widowed, single. The tables had sums next to these lines. It was a new science, moral arithmetic, as it was called in reports. Officials, armed with logic and pens, measured virtue in numbers. Anyone who deviated from the norm automatically became the subject of observation and a source of funds. Where preaching had previously been effective, now tables were used. But tables were even more frightening. They did not inspire pity, knew no doubt, and were incapable of shame. Shame was built into their formula. With the Protestant Reformation, the concept of personal labor in the name of faith only reinforced this mechanism. Pastors said that wealth and order were signs of being chosen. This meant that poverty and loneliness were signs of decline. Against this backdrop, voluntary contributions to moral improvement funds began to look like a means of self-salvation. Women, especially craftswomen, continued to pay. Now, not under pressure from officials, but out of fear of eternal condemnation. The church seemed to have stepped aside, but its language remained in forms. Even the word chastity was replaced with public benefit, but the meaning remained unchanged. One had to pay for the right to be recognized as virtuous. By the beginning of the 18th century, such funds had spread throughout northern Germany and the Netherlands. They were officially managed by councils of benefactors, but controlled by the magistrate. Every year, reports were published with the exact amounts of donations and the names of the donors. It is curious that women's names were almost always accompanied by notes such as unmarried, widow, or childless. Formally, this was done for accounting purposes, but in reality, it turned the accounting department into a catalog of social isolation. The name became a label. When historians later counted the number of such records, it turned out that the majority of contributions came from single women. Collective repentance continued to feed the system. In Catholic countries, the mechanism worked differently, but the goal was the same. There, maiden protection funds were created at monasteries and cathedrals. Formally, they were intended to help girls from poor families so that they could get married or enter a convent. But part of the funds were collected through special duties, similar to the old chastity taxes. In Naples, for example, at the beginning of the 18th century, there was a tax called contributo di virtù, contribution of virtue. It was paid by widows and unmarried women who owned shops or houses. The funds were used to maintain shelters. But reports show that most of the money went to pay officials' salaries. Where moral justification was once invented, corruption became almost a virtue. The same books contain other examples: the Venetian tax on penitent monasteries, the Florentine contribution to the education of virgins, and the Roman contribution to the vow of purity. These are all different names for the same phenomenon: attempts to turn control over women into a stable source of income. The most paradoxical thing is that all these institutions were formally created in the name of protecting the weak. No one considered themselves a criminal. Everyone believed they were serving the greater good. This was the main strength of such systems. Evil did not need justification. It looked like order. Secular authorities, observing the success of church initiatives, quickly realized that morality could be monetized no worse than salt or wine. In some principalities, public sobriety funds and good manners commissions appeared, to which former tax collectors were appointed. Their job was to monitor the decline in discipline and impose symbolic fines for indecent behavior. The fines went to the same city budget. Thus, morality became another source of income equal to market or mill duties. It is curious that it was during this period that the expression economy of virtue appeared. It was first used by a German lawyer in a treatise on municipal expenditure. He wrote that morality is also capital, and those who know how to manage it will never experience a deficit. Later, this phrase became an aphorism in administrative circles. Under the slogan of moral governance, new commissions, bureaus, and supervisory boards were created. They all sincerely considered themselves reformers, but in reality, they only improved the system of soft coercion. Archival documents from that time are striking in their coldness. There are no emotions in them, only numbers. The contribution for moral good is so many florins. The number of participants is so many. The percentage of non-payers is insignificant. Not a word about what lies behind these figures. No shame, no fear, no mention of the people who paid, because there was no other way to survive. Accounting replaced conscience. This was the birth of modern administrative control, when morality ceased to be an internal matter of the soul and became an object of statistics. Elsbeth's case was sometimes recalled in universities where the history of law was taught. It was cited as an example of unsuccessful regulation of morals. Professors spoke of it with cold irony as a curiosity of the past. But in the private archives of the same cities, documents appeared where the wording almost literally repeated the old ones. Only instead of unmarried craftswomen, they now wrote persons without family obligations, and instead of chastity ta, they wrote civil contribution. Thus, the myth of the old levy was revived, but without scandal. No one rebelled because everything seemed reasonable. The 18th century brought the idea of public benefit as the main criterion of virtue. Philosophical treatises wrote that every citizen should be useful through labor, taxes, or exemplary behavior. Those who were not useful were considered a debt to society, and if they could not pay their debt with labor, they had to pay with money. There was no way out of this logical circle. Thus, bureaucracy finally swallowed up morality. It is telling that even in the era of reformers and humanists, when hospitals, orphanages, and schools were being established, none of these institutions abandoned the principle of voluntary participation. This participation was required not only in the form of money, but also in the form of demonstrations of obedience. A townswoman who did not attend charity meetings or make donations risked being placed on the list of indifferent people, in fact, in the same position as Elsbietka once was. And although formally no one spoke of sin anymore, the very structure of guilt did not disappear. It simply ceased to be religious and became social. By the end of the 18th century, when the first enlightened thinkers began to write about human rights, city authorities had already accumulated a century of experience in governing through morality. They had learned to turn any virtue into a report and any weakness into a source of income. Even when words about freedom and equality were heard on the streets, the offices still kept books of voluntary donations. And at the bottom of each page was a reminder: virtue must be confirmed by action, that is, by payment. Looking at these documents today, it becomes clear that the history of the piety tax is not an isolated episode, but a pattern. It was repeated in different countries, under different names, and each time it was justified by good intentions. First, it was a levy for chastity, then a contribution to virtue, then a tax for public improvement. But the essence remained the same. Society demanded a ransom for the right to be respected. When Europe entered the age of factories, smokestacks, and newspapers, it seemed that the old morality had disappeared along with church ordinances. But accounting, like memory, outlives faith. Factories grew up in place of monasteries, and managers took the place of preachers. And yet the language remained the same. Instead of the words chastity and sin, work discipline and order appeared. But the essence remained the same. The body of the worker, especially the woman, still belonged to the system, and deviation from the norm had to be paid for. In the mid-19th century, industrial inspection reports contained familiar phrases such as allowances for single female workers are deducted from their wages in accordance with factory charity rules. The factory no longer called it a tax, it called it self-help. But those who refused to make the contribution risked losing their place in the dormitory or health insurance fund. Thus, the old levy for morality turned into a contribution for loyalty. Everything that had previously been justified by religion was now justified by the logic of production. Historians of the manufacturing era call this the rebirth of morality through labor. Women's good behavior committees were created in factories, where older workers monitored the behavior of younger ones. Formally, they were engaged in mutual assistance, but in reality, they controlled private life, who lived with whom, who received letters, who was late after Sunday. These committees were financed by the so-called Moral Welfare Fund, the very same that was once called the chastity tax. The records contained lines such as voluntary contributions and donations from unmarried workers, voluntary but mandatory, as before. In France, at the end of the 19th century, the first women's societies for moral purity appeared. They fought against prostitution and unmarried debauchery and collected funds for the re-education of the fallen. Their slogan sounded noble, but the mechanics were the same. Fees, reports, lists of participants. Many working women contributed money simply because otherwise they could be excluded from the mutual aid fund. Under the guise of moral reform, the same social filter operated as in the town of Elsbeth. Pay up, and you will be left alone. In Great Britain, the Victorian era turned morality into an administrative philosophy. Every factory had a board of trustees. Every parish school had a fund for well-behaved girls. Unmarried female teachers were required to transfer part of their salaries to these funds in order to be eligible for a pension. Officially, this was explained as concern for female dignity, but the structure itself replicated the medieval model. Virtue as a subscription. If a woman married, she was not entitled to a pension. She came under the protection of her husband. If she remained single, she had to pay more. Even in industrial society, loneliness continued to be considered a deviation that could only be corrected with money. The situation was no better on the continent. In Prussia, the state inherited the logic of Lutheran discipline and extended it to civil service. Female civil servants, widows, and teachers had to make an annual contribution to the Fund for Welfare and Women's Support. This was considered a sign of loyalty. One report from 1887 states explicitly, "The contribution strengthens the moral climate of the institution and prevents frivolity." Thus, the ancient fear of unmarried women out of control survived 3 centuries and only changed offices. Catholic countries responded with their own forms of control through monastic orders and parish charities. In Italy and Spain, there were even special good name funds, where women contributed money so that their surnames would not be associated with poverty. The money went to dowries for poor brides, or to maintain houses for correction. Those who did not pay were automatically placed on the list of indifferent people. Once again, voluntariness turned into obligation, and shame into a form of accounting. At the beginning of the 20th century, when Europe was experiencing industrial crises and wars, the idea of moral levies was transformed into a system of social taxes. States began to directly regulate assistance to widows and mothers by creating support funds. Formally, this was a step forward. It was no longer necessary to justify one's loneliness. But the principle itself, that a woman's personal circumstances were subject to financial assessment, remained. Bills were debated on what percentage of tax should be levied on childless or single people. Even within the walls of Parliament, it was said that the state should encourage virtuous families and tax those who deviate from them. Thus, the idea of a pious levy moved from the church to the cabinet. During World War I, a tax on celibacy did indeed exist in several countries. In Germany, it was called Junggesellensteuer, bachelor tax. Men paid it, but the motive was the same. Society demanded compensation for refusing to participate in the normal family model. Widows were subject to additional charges for the defense of virtue, that is, for the maintenance of shelters for soldiers' brides. The historical irony was that the tax, once devised against women, now worked against men, but on the same moral grounds. Control over the body, under the guise of caring for the state, became universal. After World War II, the world changed, but the habit of measuring morality by numbers remained in the most unexpected places. In post-war Europe, women's rehabilitation funds, single mother support funds, and morality protection commissions were created. Their reports, once again, echoed the old words: participation, voluntariness, responsibility. And each time, there was a hidden question behind them. Who is worthy of help, and who is not? Elsbeth's fate was repeated in a new guise. Now her place was taken by women who were assessed for trustworthiness before receiving benefits. Even in countries where equality was enshrined in law, social statistics continued to record deviations, childlessness, loneliness, non-compliance with family norms. These categories determined the amount of taxes, benefits, and payments. Thus, the old levy, renamed demographic policy, continued to exist under the guise of caring for the future of the nation. And if in the 16th century the magistrate hid behind the legend of chastity, in the 20th century the official spoke of stimulating the birth rate. The difference was only in words. The myth of the tax on unmarried women outlived all its real counterparts. It remained in the popular memory as a parable of the hypocrisy of the authorities, as if there had been a decree somewhere forcing women to pay for chastity. Historians argue about whether such a law existed in the literal sense. The archives confirm only isolated cases, such as the city of Elsbeth. But the myth itself turned out to be more plausible than the fact, because it accurately expressed the essence of the phenomenon. The authorities will always find a way to make morality pay. This theme recurred many times in popular culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. Writers, journalists, and filmmakers told stories about taxes on love, loneliness, and women's honor. Each time, the public perceived them not as fiction, but as a recognizable truth. Newspapers ran articles titled "Tax on Chastity Reintroduced in France." Humorous, but disturbing. People laughed because they felt that laughter was the only defense against the old threat. Even if the tax itself disappeared, the authorities' habit of evaluating virtue remained. Today, with the archives digitized, historians find traces of these levies in dusty books. Obscure wording, cross-referenced signatures, forged seals. They read them as symptoms of a time when shame was an accounting term. The sums are small, a few hellers, a few kopecks, but behind each coin lies someone's submission. These numbers are the shadows of human destinies. There is no tragedy in them, but there is fatigue that lasted for centuries. The city where Elsbeth once lived is now a tourist destination. All that remains of the old neighborhoods are the lines of the pavements and a fragment of the wall. In the local museum lies a copy of that very ordinance, a sheet of paper on which faded ink reads, "Collection for Chastity." Visitors read it as a curiosity, unaware that what they have before them is the formula on which the entire history of social control is built. The paper is cracked, but the meaning lives on. It is repeated every time the authorities promise moral order in exchange for obedience. This document perhaps encapsulates the whole paradox of the era. The more society talked about virtue, the less it believed in it. Morality became not an internal quality, but an external service, paid for by receipt. From taxes on chastity to modern fines for inappropriate behavior, the same thread runs through it all, an attempt to turn conscience into a budgetary tool. And if you look at it from a sufficient distance, it becomes clear. This is not a story about a woman, nor is it a story about a city. It is a story about how any authority, sensing a deficit, turns to the most profitable currency, human shame. Thus ends the chronicle of the pious tax, not with a date or a verdict, but with a recognition. Morality, once entered into the accounting books, will never again be just morality. It will become an account, a report, a norm, a law, anything but an internal choice. And every time someone utters the words moral order again, somewhere in the archives, a line from the old charter will flash up, contribution for chastity. Because history that has been forgotten does not disappear. It waits for the numbers to become conscience again.